Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to call this meeting to order. First of all, I would like to welcome you all, those of you who are physically present here and those who are online. You are most welcome to this side event. Thank you so much for coming. It's a Saturday. It's a Saturday afternoon. We are in a very beautiful country, and I know a number of you haven't even had lunch, but you are here. That underscores the fact that this is a side event, which is really important to you all. So thank you so much for coming. This side event, the title is Food Security and Cross-Border Trade, Navigating Challenges and Opportunities amidst the implementation of the agreement establishing the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. So the issue is about food security, cross-border trade, and the CFTA. This side event is organized by the ECA Subregional Office for Eastern Africa and the Southern and Eastern African Trade Information and Negotiations Institute. Maybe I'll ask my panelists to introduce themselves. I'll start with myself. I'm the moderator. I'm Jane Narunga. I'm the Executive Director of the Southern and Eastern African Trade Information and Negotiations Institute. We work within Eastern and Southern Africa. We are Pan-African NGO. We advocate for fair, equitable, and inclusive trade, fiscal, and investment policies and practices. I will ask Andrew.
Good afternoon, everybody. I noticed, Jane, you were reading the acronym for your own NGO. CFTA is very easy to remember, yes, but the full name is not so easy, actually. Okay. So I'm Andrew Mould. I'm the officer in charge for the Subregional Office for Eastern Africa. And together with CFTA, we planned this event. And it's partially around a report that we've got, which will be coming out shortly, entitled Improving Food Security in Eastern Africa through Greater Interregional Trade, a review of the issues. And in the presentation I'm about to give, I will take you through some of the points raised in that report. Over to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Farai Zimudzi. I am the FAO Subregional Coordinator for Eastern Africa ad interim, but I'm also the FAO representative for Ethiopia. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for coming this afternoon. My name is Channing Arndt, and I'm the director of the Global Trade Analysis Project, which is based at Purdue University, but operates globally. And we've had the pleasure of working with UNECA for many years on the African Continental Free Trade area in terms of simulating the impacts, and we're a source of data for analysis of trade issues globally and within regions. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Aziz Jaid. I'm an Economic Affairs Officer within the Subregional Office for North Africa within ECA, working mainly in trade and regional integration.
Okay, thank you so much. Those are our panelists, and it's a great panelist panel. And I would like to thank them for taking time off to be here. Just a few words about our event. We are going to have a conversation, and it's going to be a reader conversation. And please feel free to raise a comment, an issue, as and when you want to. We are going to have a conversation around the current state of food security in Africa. And we are going to look at the potential impact of the CFTA on food security. We are going to have a conversation again on the barriers to intra-regional trade in food, but also explore opportunities for enhancing cross-border trade in agricultural trade. We are going to look at how we can be able to leverage on the CFTA to address the challenges, but also take advantage of the opportunities to increase food trade within Africa and within the East African region. Because the study on which this event is based is on East Africa, but the lessons and the whole discussion is going to be about Africa. And we hope that at the end of this conversation, we are going to have some strategic and transformative actions and proposals which we can be able to forward to the CFTA Secretariat and also to the UNECA to be able to see how we can be able to effectively implement the CFTA. I'm going to start with asking Dr. Andrew Maud to present the study on which this side event is based. The study is on improving food security in Eastern and in Eastern Africa through greater intra-regional trade. It's a review of the issues. So, Dr. Andrew Maud, you have the floor. But as I have pointed out, if there is any issue you want to raise during his presentation, you just say so. And maybe if you want clarification, if you want to add on, please don't wait until the end of the presentation. So, Dr. Andrew Maud, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jane. So the presentation I'm going to give is going to take you through the main points of this report. And I apologize, there's a lot of charts and numbers in it. I tend to speak in numbers more than in words as an economist. But I think it's important that we have a common understanding of some of the basic statistical facts about regional food security, both at a continental level and specifically for Eastern Africa. So, let's see if the slides move. I'm afraid they don't. Yeah, I think that might be the only. So it moves, but very slowly. So this is the report on the right that we were mentioning. And the main objectives really was to understand the links between trade and food security better, and how greater inter-African food trade specifically can help improve food security. And we run through a lot of the statistics in terms of assessing the current food trade patterns, exploring the trade imbalances, the barriers, the opportunities, also the kind of products which are traded in regional markets. And finally, there's some conclusions at the end for policy recommendations. So schematically, and this is borrowed from a colleague in Kigali, actually, from FAO, we discuss what we mean by food security. And there's a long-standing discussion there of the distinction between food security or food self-sufficiency. And this schematic overview here shows that while there's lots of advantages to having a more liberalized trade regime for food, there are also some potential downsides and risks, such as import competition, which can have an impact on local farmers, for example, or excessive growth of exports, which can cause environmental degradation. So we have some consideration of the issues about food trade liberalization. And we make the point that we're specifically arguing for greater inter-regional food trade rather than a more liberalized trade environment in general, although that has its merits as well. and demerits, but we're specifically asking about, what could be the potential benefits, particularly for Eastern Africa, from more liberalized food trade. So as we move on, let me take you through some of the context and challenges for African food security, looking at also some of the global dynamics, because I don't think it's commonly understood the extent to which the global food system is under tremendous changes in the recent past, over the last few decades. So in terms of food security, I'm very sorry, you can't actually see the numbers on this particular graphic. The red line at the bottom is actually the number of undernourished people by region, and the red line is the African continent. And you can appreciate from the graph, the green is Asia, actually, and numerically, according to the FAO estimates of the number of undernourished people, the percentage is significantly higher. If I remember correctly, I can't read it from here. I believe it was 26%. No, it's higher than that, isn't it, for the African?
26?
No, it's not as high as that for the African continent. I have it here in the book. In any case, the point is actually still the largest number of undernourished people are not on the African continent, but the numbers have been trending upwards for Africa, and that's the subject of concern, I think, and particularly for our sub-region in Eastern Africa, because Eastern Africa is responsible for almost half the total in the continent. So there seems to be some particular challenges for food security for our Eastern African countries. Now, one of the reasons food security has, of course, been in a vulnerable situation over recent years has been the incredible rise we've seen in food prices. And here we have a chart which shows real food prices globally since the year 2000. And you can appreciate it's been on a quite sharp upward trajectory with price spikes, particularly after the global financial crisis in 2011, 2012 were very pronounced. But the ones just after the COVID pandemic in 2022 really was very pronounced indeed, and it reaching 3 times the level of the prices in real terms compared to the year 2000. And I thought it might be interesting just to look at the trends more precisely over the last few years, because if you look in 2021, food prices started to rise, reflecting problems in global logistics, for example, with food. In 2022, of course, we had the start of the Ukraine war, and that caused a really large spike in global prices. 2023, we did actually see some relief, and prices started to come down. And you can see that in the food trade balances of some of our member states. However, before we think that the crisis is over, actually in 2024, the trend was again upwards. So we're not out of the woods yet in terms of continental food security. And at the same time, I think it's often not appreciated in discussions on food security, the extent to which this is a global problem. The food production and food exports have become highly concentrated. So the world is gradually dividing into a world of super exporters and a majority of countries which have become net food importers. You can see that in this graphic in terms of cereal production, which is very much concentrated in the temperate parts of the world, although China, India, and Brazil also have significant levels, but cereals production is quite concentrated. And you can see this particularly in the next graphic. So, for example, 3 countries account for around 60% of global production of maize. And with rice, it's almost a similar percentage. So we have China, Brazil, and the United States in maize, being the predominant producers, Bangladesh, India, and China for nearly 60% of global rice production. So an incredible concentration. And you will often hear in common discussions about food security that Africa is one of the worst hit continents by food insecurity. Now, just in aggregate terms, FAO data shows us very clearly that's not the case. So the next graphic here shows us which are the countries, which are the net exporting regions. I deliberately left off Oceania, which includes Australia and New Zealand, because it goes off the scale a little bit. I wanted us to concentrate and see the trends more clearly. But Australia and New Zealand are important agricultural producers globally, and they're net exporters of food. The Americas, both North and South America, are major exporters, net exporters of food. And the European Union over the last 10, 15 years has switched from being a net importer to be a net exporter as well onto global markets. We then see Africa, which currently for 2022 had a $47 billion deficit in net food trade. But Asia, you can see, has a far more serious problem. It's 6 times larger, its food trade deficit, compared to the African continent. And this is true even when we express it in per capita terms, because of course Asia, with 60% of humanity, if you divide it, the figure through by the number, it's still about double the level of the African continent in terms of its food trade deficit, which may come as a surprise to some people. These are not the most recent figures. The FAO data set actually goes up to 2022 currently from the statistical yearbook for 2024. The 2023 figures are slightly more encouraging, as we will see. So food import dependence is a global trend. It's not just a case of Africa being affected. And this next graphic here, we see which are the major net food exporters. And you've got the 5 leading net food exporters here, starting with Brazil, the Netherlands, Australia, Indonesia, and Argentina. Now the figure, the net balance for Africa, that's to say its food exports minus its food imports, was actually reduced in 2023 with the declining global food prices. The net balance was minus 22 billion US dollars. So there was a quite significant improvement from 47 billion to 22. But you may be surprised to know that there's a number of countries with much larger aggregate food deficits than the African continent, including Saudi Arabia, South Korea, the United Kingdom, and believe it or not, the United States of America. In recent years, the United States of America has switched from being a net food exporter to a net food importer. It's a major producer of a lot of products onto the global food markets, particularly in cereals, for example. But at the same time, it's also a big importer, and its balance has switched. Then we have Japan, and then we have China. So I think this is interesting just to contextualize where is the African continent. There are individual countries which have a more serious problem in terms of the level of food imports, although that leads us to the question of affordability, of course. Now, looking at Africa's food trade deficit as a percentage of our GDP, you will see that food exports have broadly kept pace with the expansion of the economy over the last 25, 30 years. And it's around 2.2% of GDP. Food imports have been rather more variable and we're trending upwards and currently at around 3.2% of GDP. That leaves us with a net deficit, currently standing at 0.8% of GDP. So it's not actually at the worst point it's ever been. That was actually during the previous global price spike back in 2011, 2012. But it clearly, when you factor in issues of food security, you have to consider affordability and ability to pay for food imports. So where does Eastern Africa specifically stand with regards to this kind of data? Well, the first thing I think to stress is regionally, Africa's food trade deficit is extremely concentrated. So Northern, Central and Western Africa are net importers as regions, but you can see from the graphic, North Africa is responsible for the bulk of the food import bill. But also countries such as Nigeria and Angola sustain quite large food trade deficits. In Eastern Africa, we're going to go into that now. So Southern Africa is actually near trade balance, and South Africa is a big net food exporter to the region. But let's have a look now more closely at the figures for Eastern Africa. Eastern Africa traditionally was actually a net food exporter. And these are the exports expressed in billions of US dollars. And that went up to over 12 billion US dollars for 2023. These are the import figures. And I should stress with these figures, what we've done, we've deducted the intra-regional total. So it is what Eastern Africa, the 14 countries that we count as Eastern Africa at ECA, imports from the rest of the world vis-a-vis exports to the rest of the world, but deducting the intra-regional component. And you can see in the last few years since the COVID pandemic, it's tipped into a negative balance. Yeah. Whereas previously, there were periods when there was a net imbalance, but generally, in the early years of the 2000s, the region was a net food exporter. And finally, we see that the figures expressed as a percentage of GDP. So actually, the food trade deficit for the region is smaller than the African continental average at around 0.3% of GDP. That doesn't mean it's not a problem for individual countries. And of course, affordability, our sub-region is also with lower per capita incomes than the continental average. So there is a challenge there. What kind of products are being imported? Well, it's quite interesting to see the comparisons. And again, this comes from the FAO AUC report on the AfCFTA and how that can improve food security. You see here that Eastern African figures, this is the food import dependency ratio. So vegetable oils, 86% imported. In cereals, actually, it's relatively lower than you'll see on the continental average. So it's around 19%. And in a lot of other products, you will see that the region is pretty self-sufficient in a lot of foodstuffs, or the import dependency ratios are very low, especially when you compare it to some of the other sub-regions. Let's also not forget, when we consider these trends, the informal cross-border trade, which is extremely intense in sub-region. We struggled to find a recent study specifically on agriculture and food trade. There are a lot of numbers that are produced on informal cross-border trade, but not specifically on the agricultural production. So one we found from over 10 years ago was already reporting 1.2 million metric tons of production across 36 East African border crossings that they were measuring. And that included 488,000 tons of maize, 300,000 tons of beans, et cetera, et cetera. So you can appreciate that the informal sector side is not included in these formal sector statistics that I'm showing you. But if we're going to do a true analysis of food security for the region, we need to take it into account. Yeah. Countries like Somalia, for example, their livestock trade, the vast bulk of that is informal and very significant for the region. So to just summarize these figures, which countries are the most food import dependent? If it looks like a crocodile here with a mouth open, that means you're food import dependent. Okay, the blue line is the exports, the brown orangey line is the imports. So you can see Burundi has quite a significant gap between food exports and imports. Comoros, the island states, normally in this situation you would expect. DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, its food imbalance has widened significantly. Somalia has some challenges in this regard, and South Sudan. So those are the 5 countries we identify as clear net food importers in our sub-region. Now, the leading food export countries may surprise a few people, actually. One here, I was having a discussion with colleagues from Seychelles about these figures. They have a very strong export industry of fish, which brings in about $500 million currently a year. And according to the UNCTAD data that we have, which comes from Comtrade, it seems that that's enough to outbalance all the food imports that they're reliant upon. Now, in discussion, we find that actually we're not so sure that the international statistics here concur with the national statistics, and the officials are telling me that actually their food imports were a lot higher. So this might not be completely reliable. This is one of the challenges I think in the panel we should discuss actually about the reliability of a lot of the data, particularly on food trade, because sometimes we see this difference between what national authorities are telling us and what the international data sets say. So Seychelles, Tanzania has a very large food trade surplus. Last year, it put 1.2 million tons of maize onto the regional food market, for example, because of excess. Yeah. We also have Madagascar. Now that's principally, I guess, it's vanilla exports, but importing a lot of foodstuffs as well. And then Uganda, the other major net food exporter. So in terms of aggregate terms, really, it's Tanzania and Uganda, which are the big net exporters onto the regional market. Yeah. Next slide. Then there's a few countries which are close to food trade equilibrium, where the balance is not so marked. So Eritrea, quite a dramatic story, actually. They managed to reduce their food imports significantly. Our executive secretary yesterday was mentioning the case of the program they have building 800 micro dams around the country. So they really had a program of trying to reduce food import dependence. And it seems from the figures that we have, that's been quite successful. Rwanda is balanced on the international statistics, but when I look at the national statistics from the National Statistical Agency in Rwanda, it's not so balanced. Actually, you have quite a serious food trade deficit in recent years. Then we have Ethiopia, which has had a bumpy ride. It was in deficit, then more or less balanced, and seems to have tipped over into a negative in the last few years. But perhaps our colleague from FAO can show some light on that. And then we have Kenya, which has prodigious amounts of exports, but at the same time has become quite food import dependent as well. So the net balance actually in recent years has been more mixed. So that's basically a summary of the data for the region. I don't wish to take up too much more time so we can have that full panel discussion, but just to take you through some of the kind of products which is driving intra-regional food. So it tends to be the kind of foodstuffs where hardly anything goes to the regional market are the cash crops. The coffees, the teas, the spices. Those are destined for the international markets. That's also true for fish and live animals. So countries like Somalia exporting an enormous amount of livestock towards the Middle East, for example. The products where we see intra-regional trade is really very pronounced is things such as the cereals, predominantly, sugar, honey, dairy products. There you'll see that the principal market for our producers is the regional market. In terms of some of those cash crops, you can see that Kenya is the #1 supplier in the region. Kenya, Ethiopia, Madagascar, Uganda, Tanzania. In vegetable and fruits, Kenya is also the leading producer. Seychelles in fish as the exporter. Live animals is actually Somalia, and sugar, Uganda. Now, I wanted to say a few words about this. It's a long-standing debate amongst agricultural specialists about the trade-off, what's seen as a trade-off by some economists between cash crops and food crops, whether you should be concentrating on producing staples for your population or taking an alternative interpretation of food security, exporting cash crops, and in exchange earning foreign exchange, by which you can afford the food imports. Now, the case of Kenya was very interesting during the COVID pandemic. Data from their National Bureau of Statistics showed that actually there was a sharp decline in the production of cereals post-pandemic. Even in 2023, when there was some recovery, according to their data, in quantitative terms, cereals were down 10% compared to the pre-pandemic levels. But what it was clear was actually their performance in horticultural products and the teas and coffees, for example, did very well. they were kind of shielded from the effect of the pandemic. And that's partly through policy, because government at the time was trying to defend its source of foreign exchange earnings. And tea prices internationally were very high at the time as well, I believe. So their exports to Pakistan, for example, that year were record. So you can appreciate the outcome was good in terms of the macro thing of sustaining the economy during this period of crisis, but not so good from the point of view of defending staples, which were clearly suffering at the time. Now, I don't think it's only the COVID pandemic impacting on these figures. Of course, we had some climate impacts that were really quite negative. But I thought this data was interesting to put that debate into context. So finally, the final section here is really going to be about what the opportunities for greater regional trade from the implementation of the AfCFTA. And here we see that in terms of continental producers, East Africa is pretty notable. So Ethiopia is the largest, in value terms, the largest producer of cereals on the continent, even ahead of countries like Nigeria or Egypt and South Africa. In terms of dairy, Kenya has the number. No, sorry. Yes, dairy is number one spot. And you have Ethiopia in the fourth place there. In vegetables and fruit, the region is not so pronounced as some of the other countries on the continent. And in our study, we actually look at the agricultural comparative advantage, both in production and in food trade. And again, this is borrowed from colleagues from FAO in our Kigali office there. This basically shows the similarities in production of the kind of crops which are produced across the African continent, comparing the sub-regions. If the percentage is high, it means the degree of correlation is very high between. And you can see for Central Africa and Eastern Africa, there's a degree of competition, let's say, in terms of production structure, somewhat lower with the other sub-regions. But in terms of trade, what East Africa is trading, actually the levels of complementarity are very high with the other sub-regions. So I thought this was a very interesting analysis which our FAO colleagues produced. And you can also sense the scope for intra-regional trade as well by looking at regional food prices. So for example, maize, like in June last year, price was 191 US dollars per ton, metric ton in Tanzania. But you can see here in Ethiopia, the price was 722. So almost 4 times higher. Now, if you had greater inter-regional food trade, in principle, such large differences shouldn't exist. You see similar patterns in beans, for example, where here it was Kenya with the highest prices in the region. So a regional food trade market could go some way towards limiting such high prices, and smoothing out. Another element we use in our report to argue in favor of greater regional food trade is the fact that it seems that the agricultural cycles in our member states are not highly correlated. So we have the GDP figures for agriculture, for example, for a number of our member states. This first, sorry, went too fast. Let me go back. You can tell the story easier one by one. This is the agricultural GDP of Kenya, which you can see has had quite a volatile ride and quite a few negative periods there as well. This is since 2019, quarterly data. And this is the trend for Rwanda. And you can see it's almost the opposite, polar opposite. Then we have the figure for Uganda, which definitely is followed a different kind of trend, isn't it? We tested this proposition just by looking at the correlation, the simple correlation between the figures, and you can see they're extremely low. That gives a good fundamental reason for being able to increase food trade. You know, that when one agricultural sector in one country is suffering, and even within countries, I think Hanin is probably going to suggest to us, even within countries often, you know, you can have a difficult situation at one point of the year. Greater inter-regional food trade can definitely improve this situation, balance things out. Yeah. So one of my colleagues ran some econometric analysis to see what the state had been regarding intra-regional food trade, just looking at existing regional agreements, and that includes East Africa Community, COMESA, IGAD. And he did this on a continental level just to see what had been the impact on those agreements in terms of increasing the intra-regional food trade. And he found that the increase had been around 15% to agricultural trade thus far under existing regional agreements. Now, one of my favorite studies that reviews the impact of all regional economic communities on existing trade flows is by the Ghanaian economist AfCFTA, and he carries out a comprehensive review of other studies as well. And he finds that the average is around a 27 to 30%, 32% increase in intra-regional trade if you are a member of a regional economic community. So you can see that the increase in agricultural trade has actually been quite significantly less than the average for all trade. It suggests that there's some significant impediments to intra-regional food trade. And that will take us on to the final discussion, which is really about the trade and non-trade barriers. Now, our colleagues in Addis Ababa have been undertaking some computable general equilibrium modeling simulations to see what the benefits from the AfCFTA would be. And I won't take you through the details except to comment on the highlights from that study, which is still to be released, actually, the detail behind these simulations. But it basically reveals that the potential benefits are up to 60% increase in intra-regional trade under the AfCFTA. And the interesting thing is the benefits is through the processed agricultural products more than the raw agricultural materials, which gives impetus to the idea we need regional value chains, value addition. That's where I think our member states can really capture a greater share of this continental increase in food trade. My final two slides. This looks complex, but it's not. It's actually just the regional blocks in the African continent. And as a matrix, you can here see which region, what's the average tariff on the trade between those regional blocks. And if you look across the diagonal there, so for example, if we go to Africa, the average level of tariffs is around just under 7% on agricultural products. It's not actually that high. Perhaps more significant than non-tariff barriers. If you look at the East Africa Community, tariffs are negligible, 0.1%. So essentially the problem is one of non-tariff barriers. And you see that repeatedly in the press across East Africa when there are complaints about regional food trade. COMESA, pretty low as well. IGAD region as well, within itself, actually, the tariffs are not so significant as you may think. And IGAD members are often, members of other RECs such as Kenya, Uganda belonging to EAC, and then COMESA members as well. You understand? Now, where East Africa is quite protectionist is with the rest of the world in terms of its food trade. So if you look at the tariffs for Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, Kenya, you'll see that they're around the 25% range. Now that coincides with the common external tariff which the East Africa Community has. So it's not so surprising. And then as you go down, interestingly, South Sudan, amongst our member states there, actually currently has the lowest tariffs. Although it's an EAC member, it's not using the common external tariff. So that brings me to some very quick conclusions to let the floor to the colleagues. In principle, the AfCFTA could greatly bolster intra-regional food trade, particularly in processed food products. Secondly, one message from our study is East Africa as a bloc is not that far from collective food security, although individual member states do have some serious food security issues. But to reach collective food security, we need to adopt a more coordinated approach to regional food security. And high tariffs and NTBs obviously are continuing to impede the free movement of agricultural products between our member states. And finally, and I think this is something the panel can speak more to, our report, we argue there's a need to implement CAADP, the Comprehensive African Agricultural Development Programme to address problems of yields and lack of investment in R&D and the like to help support underlying productivity in the sector. So I hope those numbers were not too overwhelming, but I thought it was important to put in context the discussion going forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maud, for that presentation, but also for the study. You know, that's really a lot of work. I have been able to read the study, the draft study. It's really amazing. And I think you couldn't present what's everything that's in the book, but in the study, but it's a really, really interesting study. And we hope you can be able to complete it and publish it. So we're also here to be able to enrich this study because it's a draft study. The study, I found the study really interesting. It debunks a number of, common belief around trade deficit, who is contributing more to Africa's trade deficit. But there are also novel and interesting innovations and ideas, for example, around the collective food security, regional food security, because when we talk about food security, we talk about national food security. So it's a very interesting study, and we look forward to Dr. Maud in completing that study and you publish it. So thank you so much. I don't know whether there are some direct questions regarding the presentation. We can be able to take that, maybe for clarification, we can take those questions or additions. I see a hand somewhere there. Okay. So we start from the other side, we come up there then.
Thank you very much. My name is Idris Akanu. I'm from Sierra Leone. From the presentation, first of all, I want to thank you very much. This is a very good study, and it's a study that we can relate to. We see some of the challenges that many of the African countries face. We can relate with that here. My question has to do with the food disparity that you presented among East African countries. When I noticed that it's quite wide, especially when you compare Kenya and Rwanda. The price of food disparity is very wide, but I want to know some of the factors. I was wondering if subsidy could play a part in explaining that. Because you will notice that countries that are normally subsidizing agriculture, and that is taken into consideration in the cost of input and other things. So when normally they trade that product, the price is lower. So probably you may want to throw light on that, if it is food security or another factor that is explaining that. And also on the interregional food trade, the impediment, especially agriculture, that you presented, and you didn't highlight exactly what the problems are, but I was wondering also if informality could play part, especially on agricultural product. If I give my experience based on our own region, in the ECOWAS region, especially in West Africa, there is a lot of trade, informal trade going on in agricultural product that is not normally captured. So, and if you look at the official statistics, you will notice that what is presented internationally is different from what is local, because the international doesn't capture the informal. Because some of the businesses you would see, the cross-border is just a kind of makeshift cross-border. Even maybe no trade official or custom official is there. So at times it creates problem. But internally, the Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Trade could get data from production and from people that are trading. And most times when they go through the border, you find out that it's not captured. So these are some of the things I want you to look at, how informality explains the impediment to regional trade. If you take that into consideration, you may see increase in trade volumes.
Okay, thank you so much, Idris. Next, then we'll come this way.
Thank you very much for that detailed presentation, very enlightening. My name is Kadiatu Ali. I'm the Deputy Minister for Finance in Sierra Leone. And in Sierra Leone now, we are doing what we call Feed Salon. So agriculture is a flagship program for our government. And what we are currently doing is we're trying to focus on growing a staple, which is rice. But then sometimes I wonder if we could, we're better off doing like a comparative advantage kind of strategy in terms of, because there are some areas where it takes a lot of labor. Some of the land may not be well suited for growing rice. If we could do maybe, I think the government has embarked on the soil testing all across the country. If we can have that data set and then focus on what it is that we can grow better in these different areas, and while we can then import rice, because for the average Sierra Leonean, we eat rice every day, and the only decision you make is what goes with the rice, every day. So every home is rice. So maybe we can start importing rice while we can maybe focus on certain, more maybe expensive agricultural products that we can export, like coffee, cacao. Those also grow in. So my question is to see what is the best strategy as you aim to become food sufficient, as you thrive, as you try to go down that path. What strategies do you have? Models can we look at as a country? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, this side. Yeah. Yes, please.
My name is Ihab from Central Bank of Egypt. I have a question and addition. First of all, the question is how adaptable are the wages to increase in prices in Africa when it gets to food prices compared to other regions in the world like Latin America or the Asia, and how frequent are the climate change attacks on Africa? Maybe in sub-regional parts of the continent, and how is that frequent compared to other areas in the world, like the other continents? When we get to the problem of data and information about trade data, I think comparing data of trade on other sectors when speaking of a certain country can to some extent eliminate this problem. I mean, when the most of the countries, major countries or trade partner tend to report different numbers in a certain sector in food, we can resort to comparing other figures in other sectors. I mean, we're talking about food. We can compare other data of trade, maybe on manufacturing, maybe on mining, etc. So that will help get to the idea that the country really manipulate the data. And that was a suggestion. One final thing is that the Committee on Risk and Early Warning of the European Commission provide to some extent some good information on climate attacks and drought and flood. So I think this can be an addition to your study when you get to integrate this into the most vulnerable regions compared to other. And finally, how can the AfCFTA help in regard of and the realm of trying to getting country to use each other's resources? I mean, when a country gets to be attacked by drought, why can't other neighbor countries, say Kenya was attacked by a drought, so why can't this country sign a protocol with Ethiopia to allow their farmers to use the Ethiopian pastures until the crisis is over? And this can be done under a certain protocol in the AfCFTA in exchange for mutual benefits. And thank you. That's all.
Thank you so much. I will go to the gentleman the other side.
Thank you very much. Allow me also to join my colleague and congratulate the presenter for this study. I mean the draft study, and I hope we'll be able also to participate to the process of bringing more data as our colleagues were suggesting. I'm the Permanent Secretary, Minister of Trade of Djibouti, and I totally join the presenter on the trade perspective when it comes to food security. We've tried through several mechanisms to address the food security issue for African countries, and that AfCFTA effectively is a unique opportunity to tackle many of those challenges that we faced during COVID period, but also each time that we notice or that we face a geopolitical issue in international markets. So the vulnerability of our countries is totally accepted, but we also notice that if we don't address these challenges collectively, none of our countries will be able in the coming years to come out with solution, because all the African countries have went through agricultural development mechanism. We all know that it's not only about because of African countries have not been able to correctly implement those policies, but because of other regions' competitiveness have not allows us to fill that gaps that our continent is facing when it comes to production, when it comes to value added, when it comes to market competition. It's a lot of challenges that also at the end of the day impacts trade between our countries. For Djibouti, we've noticed that during this presentation, the presenter have no data on Djibouti's situation when it comes to food security, knowing that as a net importers, our data is available in every COMESA region. We address it commonly with Ethiopia. We address it also at AfCFTA level. WTA level. The data are disponible, but I don't know in any those slides, yes. And so yes, the other issue also is that the main challenges that we faced when we've tried during those difficult periods to shift our import to African countries as we enhancing today the regional integration and the intra-Africa trade. We've noticed that the main challenge is the logistic. We have identified many countries. We've developed, many studies on how to diversify our import sources, and to bring the put the light on African countries, because we know that those commodities are existing in Africa. We've discussed with many colleagues in the region, Malawi, in Uganda, in Zimbabwe. Those countries was ready to provide many commodities. 6 or 7 that have been identified by our countries as critical for the food security. But logistic challenges are huge, because connectivity is, it's not only about road or ports. There is many other facilities and non-tariff barriers that need to be really addressed. Trade fairs are existing I've participated myself to many trade fairs where SMEs, African SMEs, are exhibiting foods, beans, rice, and other important cereals. But yet this linkage to exchange or to trade between us are not very efficient. So we are ready or available to provide the data to the department that present the study, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, PS. We will take maybe some. Wow. Now what do we do? Maybe if we are really brief, we can be able to listen to everyone. But let us be brief. Then we'll go to our colleagues who are online. So I will take the lead here, then come to that side. But please be brief. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Heben Klemariam, Regional Assistant for Caritas Switzerland Africa Office. Thank you for the brief presentation. As we see that the agricultural prices are range in African countries due to the climate and also food security and also economic instability. So my question is shortly is, how could you think that African trade agreements like regional integration can enhance the agricultural exports in Africa? As we see that we mentioned that beans and maize are different prices in Africa. So how can that African integration in trade can result the result in this way? Thank you.
We go the other side, the gentleman down.
Thank you, moderator. First, my name is John Kereng Awan. I'm from South Sudan. I want to comment and appreciate Dr. Moll for the assessment that is well presented. My comments is in regard to the data. It appears that the data that has been presented here for the countries that the data has been generated, their issue have been seen. But for some of the countries in which the data is lacking, the level of trade is not well clear and is not seen. For us, in our context as South Sudan, over the last 3 years, agriculture has been the top priority, and about 30% of the national budget has been given to agriculture. So when we look at, of course, there are challenges that are associated with the productivity and the food security in the country. One of the problem is the persisting flood. The flooding has been persisting for about 6 years now, starting 2019. And of course, the area that were affected by the flooding, they cannot have agricultural productivity. But when it comes to fisheries, there has been, especially in the dry fish area, there has been some export that has been made to countries like Burundi, DRC, Congo, even our neighbor Uganda. Dry fish has been crossing the border. And then, so to make it short, I don't know whether the assessment has tried to attempt to get data from South Sudan, from the Ministry of Trade on these issues, because the honey also, there is a potential, and also the market of honey is active, and export has been made in that area also. And I will also suggest that for the future assessment, if it can be customized so that assessment is done at a national level, maybe with the support of the regional office to ensure that the data is collected properly for this sector. And South Sudan will be willing to work together with the regional office to conduct some assessment on this local agricultural productivity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next. Yes, the lady.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Antoinette Mulele. I'm from Botswana. I'm agri-food systems and climate change practitioner, and also a student in managing science policy interface in biodiversity and ecosystem. So my question is mostly because he mentioned the informal sector, and also wondering that if they are not included, does that then mean the data can be biased? And the very same data is going to inform policies that which show that and support the gap between what's happening in reality and what is being expected from these theories, and basically looking at it from the future perspective. Like the very same people in the informal sector are the women and youth, and if we're making policies that are going to affect the youth in future, doesn't it show that we are somehow supporting this very same gap that is happening when it comes to implementation of such policies? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. We have two more people here. Briefly, please, the gentleman down.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. And just wanted to commend the study that has been conducted. It was quite insightful. Just to introduce myself briefly, my name is Nafal Hassani Mohamed from the African Export-Import Bank. So my question is to the presenter on whether the study include the financing aspect of food intra-regional trade. I will discuss about certain type of barriers, being non-tariff barriers, being logistic actually, and infrastructure, which are quite also hindering the level of intra-regional trade. Is there an aspect related to financing that is also has to be considered as one of the solutions to be able to unlock the potential of intra-African trade? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Lastly, your hand was up. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrew, for the great presentation. This Mubarak is from Somalia. It was very interesting, the presentation from Dr. Andrew. When he's presenting the countries who has the capacity to export fishing, for example, Seychelles, it was very interesting for us because of Somalia loses 300,000 million a year for illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. So for this reason, for this issue, is there any plan for supporting countries for tackling on this issue? In terms of livestock, as Dr. Andrew said, since last year we exported to the Gulf countries, mainly Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, almost 1 million heads of livestock, sheep, goats, and camels. So we are very dependent on exporting livestock in Somalia. So invest in livestock and was very important for us. The issue for the food security, I think Africa is facing food insecurity, but we have the capacity to export food products and as well as the grains within the African countries. So I think it's time to eliminate or remove, trade barriers, including the tariffs, and strengthen our local capacity production to strengthen our regional value chains and to reduce the impacts from the food insecurity. For the issue of cross-border collaboration is essential when it comes for the trade facilitation between the member states. Somalia has made remarkable progress for cross-border collaboration with its neighboring countries, mainly Ethiopia and Kenya. And recently we have a large project for facilitating the cross-border trade facilitation between these three countries, as well as to facilitate the movement of people and the goods within the framework of African Free Trade Area, as well as the framework of IGAD. I have a final remark. Finally, is there any strategy currently available for supporting countries those are more dependent on imported foods? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I'll go to our colleagues online. I'll ask the CFTA Secretariat, Roland, and I'm giving just 1 point each, please. Roland?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Can you get me?
Yes, please. Go ahead, please, Roland.
As that data analysis. Yes, I think one of the participants already asked question about the non-tariff measure. So I was wondering why in the presentation the author did not present any data facts on non-tariff measure, notably SPS and TBT. We all know that this, in terms of frequency index or coverage ratio, those barriers are very high, and many literature show that they are even higher than tariff policy. So my question, or maybe I missed that part because I didn't saw the analysis on non-tariff measure in the presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Roland. I'll go to Rollins. Rollins.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you, Dr. Mold, for the presentation. I had about 3 questions, but since you have restricted us to 1, let me try to cut it short. The presentation perhaps didn't give a highlight in reference to the current tariff regimes that offers that state parties have scheduled. You note that when you look at those offers, currently, you'll note that there are quite a number of state parties that have excluded liberalization agricultural items. And we are talking about the potential of trading, especially in those lines. And yet there's exclusions. When you look at some of the tariff lines in category C products, they are excluded. And maybe just to add on that, the other aspect is on simple average, the use of simple average tariff in computing the average tariff for the various RECs. I would suggest that maybe, Andrew, you would have perhaps proposed the weighted average to try to give a more clear picture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lawrence. I will go to Dr. Sako. ECOWAS, please.
Good everybody. First of thing, allow me to join my voice to other previous speakers to congratulate Dr. Andrew for this finding and his good study and presentation. I just want to be very brief. My name is Dr. Sako Seidu. I am in charge of trade policy, principal program officer in trade policy, informal trade, competition, and negotiation in ECOWAS Commission. Dr. Andrew, you saw when you showed your presentation, you notice just there is something missing relating data issues. I just want to draw our attention about one thing. In ECOWAS region, the region are their own specific. One of the first two in ECOWAS region is ATLS, ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Scheme. This ECOWAS Trade Liberalization Scheme, one side allow all the agri-product moving from one country to another country were paying duty. This opportunity and this privilege, who the region have it, what the region have it, at the same time, it is another issue to give lack to have a data relating to the agri-product. But when they are moving between country to country, they are not recorded at the border. That's why finally we know this issue is very, very important, but most of the agri-product, you know that the trade in the region is almost 60% is informal trade. And informal cross-border trade is very, very important. I like too much this word has been used by Dr. Andrew when you say collectively, we are not far to attain food security. We in ECOWAS region, finally, we develop methodology, what we call it ECO-ICBT, ECOWAS Informal Cross-Border Trade. We have made this methodology quadripartite, ECOWAS, WACTAF, UMOA, and SIPS. We put on ground this methodology to collect data. And we have data since 2010 to 2024 now. Mostly agri-product, when data has been collected, and the methodology is very strong, but in over duplication, when the product is passing on the border, and so will not be taking double account. And finally, if you go through this data, we see what we have in the international level, what we have in the national level is very, very very different. And I can see just work on this data, and we see, for example, agri-product intra-trade, it was at least 60%. When you add informal trade, informal cross-border trade, we attain almost 25%. For each percent, we miss at least $125 million who has been recorded in the data. For 5 years, we attain almost $5 million, 500 million who has been recorded in the data.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sako, for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much for those interventions, questions, and proposals. Given the time constraint, before Dr. Maud responds, I want us to hear from our panelists, and they can be able to address some of those issues. I would like to start with Dr. Channing, and I know he's going to address the issue of climate change and productivity. He's also a person who talks in terms of figures and numbers. Dr. Channing, the floor is yours.
I can try to take some of the questions, I think, and then get into some of the basic points that were made. starting with the Vice Deputy Minister of Finance in Sierra Leone on comparative advantage and rice. I mean, it's a very interesting time in the rice markets, and relying on the international market that was given a shock when the world's largest rice exporter, India, banned exports of rice in August, and that was a shock to all of West Africa, to Indonesia, to others, and so I think there is a real rationale for looking at that issue, but you could, of course, look at it regionally, right? And just because India is not a reliable exporter doesn't mean that within ECOWAS or with other partners there could not be a more reliable and efficient set. I think that does drive towards the non-tariff barriers, the infrastructure, the ability to move things, and this kind of deeper integration. And so that I think that's key, and that's where you can look. Plus, looking out onto the international market as well. I thought that from the Central Bank of Egypt, there was an interesting question on wages, and surprisingly adaptable. Big shocks right away, you don't get much of a change, and you take a shock. But if there's a sustained rise in prices, rural wages will go up, and in fact, typically poverty rates will fall on sustained price rises because the wage effect outweighs the price effect on the consumption side. I don't think that's necessarily true in Egypt. You're a very different case. A lot of irrigated agriculture, different things happening. But across the continent, that would be the case. You also mentioned frequency and severity of extreme events, and I think every region in the world, everywhere I go, we're the most affected by climate change, right? Every region says that, but definitely Africa is strongly affected. Who's more, who's less? I don't know. There's less adaptive capacity here, and worrying about I think volatility is a really powerful reason to pursue deeper integration. So that as the volatility goes up, the ability to move stuff through space improves. One of the things that I think I've been saying for many years, and there's been talk on data, and one thing that's lacking almost everywhere is timely, and I'll emphasize that, timely data on production statistics. And by timely, I mean at harvest. So, we don't produce data just so the people in this room can use them. You're supposed to be producing data so that market participants can make decisions about where to buy, where to sell, and that's just supremely important. It's very hard to price a product if you don't know how much there is. And we know in the world, when the U.S. Department of Agriculture releases its production estimates for the world prices actually move. So the world doesn't necessarily know how much there is until some official supplier says so. And in Africa, how on earth do you expect to price properly or know where to move product if you're not providing that information publicly? The other point, which I think is relevant now, is I know there are consulting firms using satellite data to look down on African nations and estimate supply. And then they're telling large multinational buyers where to go, right? And so if you don't take advantage of these technologies, that sort of information advantage and profit is going to large multinationals instead of locally, right? And so there's a really strong rationale for trying to do better, and it's timely that's super important. Let me see if there's anything else, because I should let others take from that. Yes, I think that's enough for me.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Channing. Let me go to Farai. Maybe if you have some specific questions to respond to, but there was also an issue around the shifts. because despite the figures, there is a shift from Africa being a net food exporter to a food importer. Maybe you can also say something around that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jane. One thing that came to my mind, I will, maybe before I even say what came to my mind, let me say this. As a non-trade person and surrounded obviously by very strong trade people, one thing that came to my mind is the fact that for trade to happen, there has to be production. And clearly, the trends that we are seeing on the continent, various parts of the continent, is testament to the fact that something is wrong in our production systems as a continent, by and large, and that needs to be addressed. So I'll just make a few points. I know we are short on time. I'll just make a few points regarding that end of things, not so much on the trade side. Clearly, the population in Africa, the rate of growth has outstripped our capacity for production. And we need to look at how we can make sure that our production systems, they can cope with our population growth on the continent. It's as simple as that to me as a non-trade person. So what are some of the issues? Low productivity is a key issue within the agriculture sector on the continent. When you compare Africa with other parts of the world, our productivity, our yields are shockingly low. And this is a challenge for policymakers to be able to make sure that we turn that around. So in terms of investing in research towards high-yielding varieties, whether it's crop seeds, genetics for livestock, to make sure that we are producing better, we are getting more per unit area, more per livestock unit or whatever it is. So these are issues that need to be addressed. And unfortunately, the continent over time has been disinvesting from systems that ensure that we do that. So research and development needs to be promoted on the continent. Extension systems, they need to be strengthened. There has been over the years a lot of pulling back in capacitating and capitalizing those services. So that needs to come in. The role of the private sector is also very important. On the continent, government alone obviously cannot do it by themselves. So it's important to make sure that public-private partnerships of some kind are also there as part of that. The issue of infrastructure has been spoken about variously from Andrew's presentation. This is a huge issue, infrastructure of all sorts. The state of infrastructure on the continent in the rural areas is shockingly bad. We need to do better in terms of investing in rural infrastructure, be it roads, be it irrigation systems. Again, we talked about earlier on, there was mention of issues of climatic shocks, droughts. We need more irrigation infrastructure. We are completely undercapitalized when it comes to irrigation on the continent. And this is just an example. Of course, infrastructure cuts across many different types of infrastructure. Storage infrastructure is also important in addition to everything else. One thing that we were completely silent on, in my view, is the impact of conflict on production. And especially in this particular part of the continent, in Eastern Africa, conflict is a key issue that has a very strong impact on people's capacity to produce, to access markets, and to be able to trade even. So the issue of conflict and the need for peace, policies that promote peace is really critical. So I think those are some of the points that I would like to raise. There was mention made earlier regarding the issue of the kind of choices that governments make in terms of what commodities to promote, whether they have a wholesale promotion of one particular commodity, and the reasons that go into that. I think it's really difficult to have one answer for that. Obviously, when governments make those choices, they are informed by certain considerations, political consideration. But from an agroecological point of view, we all know that it's not possible to grow one commodity across the country. So there has to be some differentiation. I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Zimuzi. Now I'll go to our last panelist, the few minutes remaining. The issue of increasing productivity has come up. And one key issue which we haven't touched on is fertilizers. Dr. Aziz, please talk about that in the few remaining minutes. Thank you.
Is it done? Yes. It's red.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'll be speaking in French, so just for you, maybe to put on your headset. Peut-être, si vous me permettez, avant de répondre à la question sur les engrais, juste rebondir sur quelques commentaires qui ont été produits par la salle et repris par les panélistes avant, sur la question de l'importance le changement climatique. Et je pense que je me réfère en particulier à une diapo de la présentation que mon collègue a fait sur certains produits ou les produits les plus importants par sous-région. Et comme je viens de l'Afrique du Nord, ça m'a interpellé d'avoir dans la liste un certain nombre de pays comme le Maroc, l'Égypte, faisant partie d'une région qui est, pour ne pas réagir à ce que le panéliste Arnaud a signalé auparavant, une des régions les plus arides au monde, peut-être pas la plus aride, mais une des plus arides au monde, où il y a cette difficulté justement en termes de disponibilité d'eau, et on parle de rareté de l'eau. Et donc, tout le système de production agricole et les modèles de développement qui donnent une importance à la production agricole sont, alors peut-être le terme est fort, remis en cause. En tout cas, il y a débat sur ça par rapport à la disponibilité de l'eau. Un certain nombre de pays de la sous-région, et pas des moindres, l'Égypte en fait partie, l'Algérie, le Maroc, et j'en passe, sont amenés à des sources non conventionnelles d'eau à travers la désalinisation de l'eau de mer, que ce soit pour le secteur agricole ou pour l'eau potable en particulier. Donc il y a cette question de changement climatique et la question de la rareté de l'eau qu'il faut aussi, je pense que c'est important de prendre en compte. Et cela fait aussi, ça me permet de rebondir sur le commentaire de l'honorable délégué de l'Égypte. Nous travaillons sur ces questions, sur la question de la rareté de l'eau. Il y a un papier qui va sortir bientôt, c'est en phase de drafting, d'élaboration. Quand je dis nous, c'est le bureau de la CEA pour l'Afrique du Nord, et ça sera publié prochainement. Je pense que ça sera utile aussi de regarder ce qu'on pourrait faire en termes de présentation, mais aussi en termes de réaction des pays membres pour le contenu du papier. Je sais que le temps est court, mais je vais aussi rebondir sur une intervention de la vice-ministre de Sierra Leone. Comme je viens de l'Afrique du Nord, et sur la question de la qualité du sol. Bien évidemment, quand j'ai écouté Madame la vice-ministre, j'ai rapidement googlé, je me suis dit, je vais quand même voir si OCP, qui est l'Office chérifien du phosphate, un géant africain en termes de production d'engrais, est-ce que l'OCP, parce que je sais qu'ils sont présents sur un certain nombre de pays africains, est-ce qu'ils ont quelque chose au Sierra Leone? Donc j'ai fait Google rapidement, Sierra Leone et OCP, et je vois effectivement qu'il n'y a pas très longtemps, l'OCP, je rappelle, c'est un géant africain de production d'engrais, a signé un accord récemment avec le ministère de l'Agriculture sur la question de Alors, je lis parce que c'est en anglais, soil health, la qualité du sol, le renforcement des producteurs et aussi les pratiques durables. Cela m'emmène à informer les participants que le Bureau Afrique du Nord de la CEA, quand je parle d'Afrique du Nord, c'est de la Mauritanie jusqu'au Soudan. Nous avons produit récemment, il y a peut-être un an, c'est aussi disponible sur notre page web, un rapport sur ce que pourrait être le rôle de l'Afrique du Nord dans cette question de réponse, en tout cas dans cette tentative de réponse à la question de la sécurité alimentaire. Et nous avons choisi un angle assez précis. L'Afrique du Nord dispose, peut-être que vous le savez, peut-être certains pas, des ressources, je vais faire très court, 2 petites phrases, des ressources en phosphate les plus importantes au monde. On parle de plus de 2/3 des ressources en phosphate disponibles en Afrique du Nord. Et donc, et comme le Maroc déjà a un certain avantage en termes de production et de commercialisation et de présence sur un certain nombre de pays, nous avons produit une analyse sur le commerce des engrais phosphatés et quel rôle pourrait jouer l'Afrique du Nord, mais en particulier le Maroc, dans la facilitation d'accès aux engrais. La publication est présente. Voilà, je vous remercie. Je suis désolé si j'étais lent.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aziz. Maybe to our interpreters, maybe they can give us about 5 to 6 minutes to wind up, because I wanted to ask Dr. Modi to address some of the issues which came up and also to wind up.
Yeah, we were actually you were going to give a short presentation on the climate change. You sure? Yeah. Okay, so there was a couple of questions specifically I wanted to answer. One was on the question from Djibouti about the numbers. Effectively, we did leave, well spotted, we did leave Djibouti out of the figures. The reason is, if you look at the trade statistics coming through Comtrade, you will see Djibouti as a net exporter of food, and actually with a strong agricultural advantage in production of certain crops. Now, agriculture is actually a very small share of the Djiboutian economy. And the reason is the trade figures are misrepresenting re-exports. So Djibouti as a port city has a lot of exports that go to Ethiopia. And that makes it look in the trade data as though it's a net exporter. And so I was not prepared to put that on the presentation. We have it in the report itself, but with a caveat below explaining that that's the problem. So, sir, if there is some numbers and data from national sources you can provide, we can certainly integrate that into the text of the report. Yeah. There was also one other.
If I may,
please do.
It's Egypt who made the comment, not Djibouti. Yeah. So I don't see any colleague from Djibouti.
Oh, you made a comment effectively on the international trade figures, and yeah, there is a big problem with regional trade figures in general. I compare all the sources I can find and get a very different narrative depending on the source I use. And it's of concern, really. And particularly when you break it down by products, when you start to come down to agricultural specific products, you see quite a lot of inconsistencies. I think this is possibly a global problem with some of the statistics, but it's particularly notable, I think, on some of the intra-African trade figures. So there was another question about numbers, and I'm just trying to see who raised that. South Sudan, yes, on the data as well. Yes, effectively, South Sudan, our report stresses the potential of South Sudan. Last year, Western Equatoria, one of South Sudan's states, actually saw agricultural production increase by about 40%. It was really quite notable. And we believe that in the future, South Sudan could play a very valuable role in regional food security. It is the country with most arable land per capita in the whole sub-region. Our report stresses the fact that actually Eastern Africa has seen a quite substantial and rapid decline in arable land per capita in practically all our economies, including land-rich economies like Uganda. Actually, you've seen a very sharp decline in recent years, and this reflects the level of population pressure and the fact that the existing plots have been subdivided continuously. So it is a real challenge. But South Sudan is the exception to the rule. Actually, South Sudan has plentiful agricultural land, a very small population, and a lot of water because it's in the Nile Delta there. So not Nile Delta, sorry, the Nile wetlands. Yeah. So there's a lot of potential for South Sudan. I think those were the statistical questions. There may have been one other. Otherwise, I don't know. Do the colleagues have any other suggestions? Jane, yourself, observations to make? Jane is a trade expert, so. Yeah. There was a couple of comments online of things that we missed out. The presentation was already too long, my presentation, to be honest, so that we do address topics like NTBs are discussed and phytosanitary standards as being a block to the intra-regional trade. Some of the detail that was asked for is in the report, but for the sake of brevity in the presentation, I thought it was more important to give you kind of a global picture of the situation and then look specifically at the African trade balances. So I focused on that. What there was actually is a discussion about the lack of spending on R&D and extension services in the region, which all the studies showed the payback is very large. There's no reason for not investing further in productive capacity. So I think your point was very well taken. Chani, I don't know if you want to say a few words on the climate change impacts that you've been looking at.
Sure. I think a really important part of the debate over what's going on with climate change and what its impacts will be, and it relates to the research questions, is basically what kind of effect are you having? Are you just sort of shocking the level, or are you decreasing kind of the rate of growth of productivity over time? And what happens is if you're decreasing the rate of growth of productivity over time, you get this ever widening effect, which becomes very large with time. A lot of the numbers that you see, including the numbers in the draft report, really assume that it's a rate effect, and therefore the numbers are very large. Statistically, it's not at all clear that there's actually, whether we have a rate effect, and it could be a lot smaller, at least historically. So that would line up with kind of the optimism that we have in the report about the productive capacities for the region. But it gets to the point that Andrew and Fry, if you think of technology or capacity as a stock of knowledge, and you think of climate as change, as taking away information, sort of depreciating that stock of knowledge, then you have a really good reason to invest, to make sure that you don't get this. Instead, it's a really big difference between 1.5% rate of productivity growth and 2% rate of productivity growth with time. So over time, keeping that going is a major element of and climate change, this long run phenomenon. And so maintaining the growth rate of productivity and also accumulation of capital in your economy is key. And I think that's a robust policy lesson that we can talk to in a very, very difficult environment for figuring out exactly what to do. So I think that's a summary.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Channing, and thanks to Dr. Maud. But maybe one issue, a bit jittery, that time has gone. What you mentioned in the study was about rapid rollout of digital solutions. The world is going green, it's going digital, and I think that's an area which we also need to look at. What kind of digital solutions are we putting forward to be able to address all these issues we are working on? Maybe that's maybe you need to address it deeper. in the study, in the report. Okay, so thank you so much, and thanks to our interpreters who have been able to give us some more minutes. Thank you so much for a very good debate. Thanks to the panelists. It was a very, very interesting conversation. I just hope we had more time. There were a number of hands which I saw, but time was not on our side. Thank you so much, Dr. Maud, and wish you all the best with the study. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, let me join in.
Yes, thanks for coming. Wow. Saturday afternoon.
Saturday afternoon, indeed. Yeah. Well done.
Dr. Maud, do you want to say?
No, just to thank everybody. Thank you to my colleague Didier as well for helping organise this, and the colleagues from ECA here in Addis, Aziz, Barre, and Channing, and above all to you, Jane. Thank you for agreeing to moderate the session.
Thank you.
Host. Thanks.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, everybody.